violence. Some people argue that human beings are inherently violent. Some people argue that human beings are encouraged to violence based off of external stimuli, whatever those may be. But whether it is you believe that we need to be more violent or less, the real question about violence for me is, what do we do about it? So let me tell you a bit of a story, if you don't mind my segueing for just a moment. There I was, watching Voyager, and at the end of the episode, I was on the phone with my mom, aghast, because I had just watched Threshold, and it was the worst Star Trek ever, in my opinion. And at the end of the day, I was ready to put the show down because of that. Now, it wasn't just Threshold. Let's be clear about this. Star Trek has always had bad eggs. I mean, literally, since the original series. I could bring out the wonderful Spock's brain as a good example of this. But there's actually, in my opinion, worse than Spock's brain, even in the original series. And I'm not going to even talk about Star Trek V. My point is, there's no category of Star Trek you can point to. The original series, the movies, TNG, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, the TNG movies, if you want to segregate them, that you can point to and say, there's no bad. But Season 2 of Voyager was like someone taking a giant baseball bat and just beating me over the head with it, over and over. And then Threshold came along, which is when they got the steamroller out and just kind of finished the job. I was ready to be done. I was so sick of it. This was garbage. This was not Star Trek as I believed it was to be, and I've tried to define that before. It was not entertaining, regardless of whether it was Star Trek or not, and it was actively unpleasant to watch. Mom and I agreed we would watch one more episode, the next one, whatever it was, because this is when they were still coming out, this is when they were new, and then we'd make our decision. And it was this episode. How does this happen? For those of you who are not aware, Meld is one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek Voyager, period, across the whole series. It is actually good enough that I place it amongst my, which is a pretty large category, but it's amongst my favorite Star Trek, period. You know, not towards the top, not like Star Trek 2 or Star Trek 6 or, you know, Best of Both Worlds or Tapestry or In the Pale Moonlight, but it is definitely in this category. It's in my favorite Trek stuff of all time. Right after Threshold. How does that happen? Now, I apologize, because this is probably going to be a long video. I have quite a few notes today. Oops, I actually need to go back. Here we go, okay. I have a couple notes for this one. But as I was rewatching this, it's one of those situations, you know, I usually do that section right at the end, you know, did I enjoy it then? Do I enjoy it now? This is one of the rare times where not only did I enjoy this before, but I actually enjoyed it more on the rewatching. Really paying attention to the nuances, the details, the subtleties. This is a great episode in my opinion. Let's talk a couple of bits about why before we really get into the episode proper. First of all, the structure of this episode is brilliant, and in my opinion is something Voyager was sorely lacking. If you paid attention to my versions of Star Trek, of Voyager I should say, you probably noticed that one of the big trends I have was I was really big against constantly having a B plot which was either vestigial, or vestigial if you prefer, or was, you know, the ship has to be in crisis because we need an action scene in the episode. They just couldn't bring themselves to do a character piece that was just a character piece. And every time they actually tried to, it was gutter trash. I shouldn't say that with absolute... Go away, cat. Go away. That's not for you. No. Bad cat. Wait. Nope, you're a prop now. So, anyways, as I was saying, as a resultant of the structure of this episode, which I'll go ahead and lay out for you right now, we've got the A plot, which is extremely character focused and is being driven by two excellent actors who are doing a great job of it. and then a B plot, which is also character focused, doesn't have any action sequences, doesn't involve stupid technobabble, and on top of that, actually has actually has relevance to continuity. Yes! Yes! That's exactly what I want. Oh my god, Voyager. Why did you just suddenly decide, you know what, let's make a great episode out of nowhere? What the hell? Well, another way, okay, I have a little note here called halfway point. This is a good sign of me enjoying something. Hey, what do you think you're doing? I can tell I'm really enjoying something when I am halfway through it. In this case, I was literally halfway through the episode and didn't even realize it. I was just madly taking notes and like, oh, and then taking notes and then, oh. And then I look up and I'm literally, actually, it was more than halfway. It was like the 30 minutes into the 42 whatever minute episode, and I'm just like, oh wow, I didn't realize I was that far along. Holy moly, you know? That's awesome. That's usually a good sign for me. We'll talk about that in a minute. Alright, so let's go ahead and start with the top thing. First of all, I want to talk about the lottery thing. Okay, we're going to start going through the episode now. Actually, I want to warn you about one thing. There's going to be something at the end of this video that's just a little bit different than my norm. It's going to be more like what I do in my Babylon 5 videos when I get to those. Spoiler alert, I guess. But I want to save that for last. For those of you who want me to discuss the actual topic brought up by this episode, I'm leaving that for last. We're going to talk about the episode first. So first thing we see is Tom Paris, first of all, grifting Harry, because Harry's an idiot. And we see him setting up a lottery. And it really is a true lottery. Now, I actually asked a couple of my friends their opinions on this subject. This is basically the B-plot. Tom Paris setting up the lottery, getting on report with Chakotay. It has to do with the whole, Michael Jonas subplot. Spoiler alert again. That'll follow through soon when we get to. I actually don't remember the name of the episode. It's Neelix's stupid episode, I believe is the name of it. Now, first thing I want to comment here is how interesting it is that this kind of concept hasn't been really explored before. I mentioned a lottery specifically, not gambling, because while this is a form of gambling, a lottery is specifically where there's not necessarily a winner each week. You all pull together, and the person dealing with it takes a portion of their own of it for their own shares, right? And they're betting in replicator rations. Both of these elements actually made perfect sense to me because A, it showcased just how little experience these people tend to have with gambling in general. B, even people who are experienced with gambling still tend to play the lottery. Admittedly, I use the lottery as well, although I've discussed that before. And C, the fact that they're using replicator rations itself is actually an interesting storytelling point because it emphasizes the setting of Voyager. I know this sounds weird because it's such a dinky little thing, it's such a minor little point, but by emphasizing that that is something of value to them, the fact that they have to ration their replication, which has never been done before, by the way, throughout all of Star Trek, with the exception of a few things in DS9, which were extreme circumstances and usually isolated. The fact that they have to ration replication really gets across the point that they actually do have limited resources, limited energy, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that's not something that Voyager does often and usually doesn't follow up on, but I want to give them props where props are due. It was a nice little touch. I also want to mention Hogan. For those of you who don't know, Hogan is the name of the engineer who appears at the beginning of this episode, right after this sequence. He's the one talking to B'Elanna. And Hogan is actually a semi-reoccurring character. This is one of those weird situations where Voyager tried to do something good and ended up shooting themselves in the foot. Hogan is one of 3 attempts that Voyager does across the first few seasons to try and build a sense of continuity. Kinda. It's because what they wanted to show is basically twofold. Number one, they wanted to show, continuity, a regular face that wasn't the regular, someone else to be in engineering, someone else to be a tactical, that kind of thing, right? And number two, they wanted the idea that if this person dies, it's significant. If this person goes away, it's significant. Now, Hogan was actually in this before. He was in Alliances. But the point here is that having him be there and then be removed is supposed to have some kind of impact. The shoot themselves in the foot part is, it kind of doesn't. The only impact Hogan's death has, oh, by the way, spoiler alert, The only impact Hogan's death has on anybody is the fact that it actually brings us to another episode, which I'm not even going to talk about. A Distant Origin, I believe, is the name of it. It's like, trying. You know what? I'll talk about this more when I get to the later seasons of Voyager. But long story short, I'll give him a C, maybe a B minus for trying. But now however, I will give Hogan credit. He's actually not a bad actor. I wish they had given him more lines, more roles, because he actually does a decent job as you know, the dude, the engineering dude. I actually don't even remember if he's Maquis or Starfleet. Anyways, now, unfortunately, even though I love this episode, and I do, it's a great episode, I have a note here which is called Neelix. Yeah, you can see where this is going. I'm going to skip all this. I've ranted about Neelix a dozen times by now. I'm just going to tell you literally and flat-faced, without actually any elaboration or anything, without any facetiousness, without any, what's the word I'm looking for? Hyperbole. There we go. Without any hyperbole. Neelix shows up to Tuvok and says, I've been studying your ancient, your holidays and your ancient rituals. I don't like your holidays because I don't think they're, cheerful enough, and I think you should resurrect some of your ancient traditions which haven't been used in a millennia because they're more interesting to me. I really don't feel like I need to say anything else about that. And you know what kills me about this is that scene was deliberately shoved in specifically for another scene we'll get to in a minute. It really was. It was shoved in there because originally it wasn't part of the script. It was shoved in there to add to the second scene. But in order for that second scene to work, they needed Neelix to be arguably the most horrifyingly annoying, frustrating, anger-inducing thing that Tuvok could encounter. And so, even for Star Trek Voyager's standards, even by Neelix's standards, he is above and beyond annoying in both of the scenes he's in this episode. And that's all I'm going to say about that. We'll get to that in a minute. So, I have a thing to talk about here. It's called suspense. Now, when I first saw this episode, up until this point, I'm just like, actually, I think it was like, just whatever. It was then we get to the end of the teaser, and we see a dead crewman. And it's kind of funny because my very first thought was he was murdered. Literally my first thought. And that's ignoring the fact that we had a very brief shot of Brad Dourif earlier, which I'll talk about him plenty this episode. But no, seriously, ignoring that, my first thought was, oh my god, a murder on Voyager. Why is that interesting? Two reasons. One, a murder on a ship in any other circumstance could be aliens, or an intruder, or a temporary crewman, or whatever. A murder on Voyager is a little bit different because they're isolated. There is no one else to show up. It's possible it's an alien intruder, and that would be a cop-out in my opinion. But if it wasn't, and we're assuming it isn't, that means one of your tightly knit crew, of whom you know you're alone, with no backup and no anything, no way to replenish your resources or your personnel or anything, decided to kill one of the others for something. And whatever that reason is, had to be significant. It had to be really, you don't just do that. Even ignoring the obvious reasons, because getting caught on a ship that size is ridiculously easy to happen. I'm sorry, it is. I just feel like to point out, I know this is a point I'm going to make later, but they don't even use Star Trek-y science for the most part. Only one little bit in order to catch the killer. Hell, it's not even that, in order to verify that they have the right killer. I'm just pointing that it's the DNA evidence thing. Even ignoring that, they would have had the capacity to catch this guy, because that's just kind of how it works, especially when you lack the ability to do anything about it. So, if you're actually going to go that further step, what caused them to do that? What made it? It was so intriguing. It was so suspenseful. It got your attention like that, and it's like, oh my god. It's actually kind of funny because the very next scene is I can't think of his name. The Doctor. There we go. That's why I can't think of his name. The Doctor says, this was a murder. And a fascinating point, again, like I said, I'm just going to blend this point in here. He uses real forensic science. He actually does. They actually did a decent amount of homework for this episode. Another thumbs up, guys. Another props to this episode. They actually did homework. No made-up science in this section. They just actually used real forensic science to showcase and how this person was obviously hit, a stationary object being hit by a motion object, or motion object being hit by a stationary object. I forget the exact term, forgive me right now, but it is a real thing. And that's how they determined this was a murder. Definite props on that. But you see where I'm going with this. You see why I think this is interesting. I almost feel like it was a shame that the suspense of who it was and why they could have done it was basically not discovered, because they pretty much jump immediately from there's a murder and it was him. But I will forgive them that because of what they did with the episode. All I want to mention is that very concept by itself is an incredibly engaging literary hook, in my opinion. Isolated circumstance, isolated atmosphere, isolated resources, isolation in every way, shape, and form. You are on a bubble, you are on a bubble of metal in this tiny little speck of in space, with nothing around you but hostility at best in every direction, and absolutely no home port of call, not for a bagrillion years. And then a murder happens on that ship. Tell me that's not interesting, just by itself. Not that I'm advocating murder. Unless it's Neelix. Nah, that would never happen. Anyways, so. You know, my next 5 notes all start with the word suitor. I want to go over specific points, though, because I really want to give you, for those of you who aren't actually watching the episode, I really want to highlight the specifics as much as I can in this episode, because a lot of attention to detail was put in this episode, and I think that's one of the reasons I like it. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but let's go ahead and start with the first of all, the gentleman who does it, Brad Dourif. Now, if you don't know who that is, go look him up, but I guarantee you've probably seen him before in at least something. Brad Dourif was also in Babylon 5, in an extremely wonderful role, in one of my favorite episodes of that show, Passing to Gethsemane. Thank you, God. And he was also in Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, and in the extended version of Return of the King as Grima Wormtongue, for which he won a couple of awards, I might add. All I'm going to say about Brad Dourif, he was also in X-Files as a serial killer who maybe kind of had telekinetic powers, but kind of didn't, but also did. It's weird. What I'm going to say about Brad Dourif is this. He tends to play really scary, creepy, psychotic characters a lot. He doesn't always. He played a kindly monk really, really well over in Babylon 5. But he does the roles with a specific flair to them, a charisma that makes him engaging and likable or understandable or sympathetic or whatever. He adds a bit of flavor to it, in addition to being, you know, obviously the villain. And I think that's one of the things that really makes him one of my favorite actors in this kind of regard. All I gotta say is Brad Dourif took Grima Wormtongue and actually made him interesting, made him charismatic in his own way, made him sympathetic in his own way. That takes work, especially if you know, the more you know about Grima Wormtongue in the Tolkienverse. Holy moly. So all I'm going to say is about this is a lot of things, but long story short, picking Brad Dourif for this was an amazing choice. And there's another amazing choice they did. They made him Betazoid. Now this is the funny part. They actually, I usually do a little bit of research on these episodes, as much as I can, not a huge amount, before I do these. And one of the things I find interesting is they didn't make him Betazoid for the reason I assumed. I'll get into that in just a moment, the real reason they did it. But there is something else that happened because of this. Making a psychotic killer a Betazoid is another one of those things that by itself is just kind of an interesting concept to me. It's one of those things that it's like, how does the well, okay, first of all, the Betazoids are kind of peace-loving beatniks, let's just be honest with ourselves. They're the closest thing that Star Trek has to space hippies. But ignoring that generalization, a Betazoid is someone who is very open by culture and societal standards, thanks to the fact that they are empathic and telepathic. Because of these things, they have moved in societally, culturally in such a way that they tend to be very open, very understanding of their emotions, their feelings, blah blah blah. And yet they make this a Betazoid who does not feel. It's a tiny little note, and it's only touched on briefly during the episode, and yet they wonderfully throw this out there, because this is a Betazoid who doesn't feel, interacting with a Vulcan who tries not to. And I think that was an amazing choice, even if it was done semi-unintentionally. Again, I'll talk about that in a moment. And the two acting against each other. Oh my God, I have nothing but praise for Tim Russ. He's a great guy. He's funny as heck in real life, and he's actually a really good actor, all things considered. He's, in my opinion, one of only 2 or 3 people who have ever actually played a Vulcan, not a half Vulcan, because Spock was half human, but a actual pureblood Vulcan properly. And that's a very small, very elite list, in my opinion. And Tim Russ does a great job of it. Sometimes I feel it is a shame they didn't do more with Tim Russ, because he plays a Vulcan so well, but then he kind of comes off as flat because he's a Vulcan. Anyways, one of the things I like before they actually get the DNA evidence and they reveal that Suitor is the killer is Suitor is wonderfully straightforward. There's only one scene in which he lies, and all of his lies are very distinct from his truth. It's beautifully subtle. I cannot possibly emulate it. Forgive me, my acting talents are not there. But basically, there is a difference in his tone, in his posture, and in the very way he moves his head and neck in relation to the rest of himself when he is telling a truth and when he is telling a lie. But it's not exaggerated. That's the beautiful part. That's the wonderful part. This isn't like, well, no offense to the game, but this isn't like L.A. Noire, where it's incredibly obvious when they're lying, because it has to be, for gameplay. I'm not ragging on the game, like I said, but it kind of had to be. They had to have a tell, like, oh, I don't know nothing about that. No, it's nothing nearly that obvious. It's really quiet, really subtle. In fact, to be blunt, I never noticed it before. It was only this time going through, as I was paying attention to what he was saying and how he was saying it, that I noticed the difference between the two. For example, one of the things he says is, did you kill him? And he'll say no, and that is a lie. But then he will immediately change his tone and posture and say, I had no reason to kill him, which is the truth. And it's wonderfully subtle, and it's just beautiful the way I'm sorry for gushing over this, but seriously, watch the episode. You'll see what I mean. It's just this tiny little notches. I love the subtlety of it. I always love subtlety when it comes off proper like that. And one of the other things about that performance, too, throughout that whole meeting, it's very obvious that Suitor is controlling himself, that he is actively restraining himself. In fact, I get the impression that Tuvok in character could tell that he was restraining himself, that he was keeping himself mentally in withdrawn, and that probably is one of the reasons why Tuvok was so interested in him on the case, and one of the reasons we only see him interviewing him, for that matter. But he's constantly doing that, and hang on. Where is it? Is this the point I want to? Yes. Okay. And then they get okay. So let's continue. Then they get the DNA evidence, and then they go straight back to the two of them. So much of this episode is built upon the strength of Tuvok and Suitor playing off each other. I didn't actually sit down and figure it out, but I believe a bare minimum of 40% of the footage in this episode is literally those two characters acting at each other. However, as anyone will tell you, an episode that does that properly with two actors who know what they're doing, that's gold. Duet, Deep Space Nine, is a great example of that. Tapestry, Next Generation, great example of that. I could keep going, but you get the general point of this. And there's two things that I really want to comment about the next section. Actually, it's like 50 things. God, I'm not even off the first page yet. I apologize for how long this is, but really, this is such a great episode. I want to talk about this so much. Okay, the look on Suitor's face when Tuvok presents him the DNA evidence. I love it. Because it's not like, or, no, I have been caught. It's the same kind of restrained thing that he's been doing this whole time, but it's a very specific type of restraint. He's got like this thing going on where he's like this. And he's just, I don't know if you can see it, but he's just shaking just a tiny bit. And he looks for him and he says, no, I guess there's no point in lying about it now. And then he just starts laying out everything. And there is a wonderfully subtle tone of relief in his voice as he's just saying, I did this, and then I snuck up behind him, and then I killed him, and blah, blah. He's just detailing it, almost like a robot. But it's like he's relieved to just say, yes, I did it. Yes, I'm not lying. And again, it's that difference in tonality from earlier. But what I love about it is, as we learn throughout the episode, this problem is something Suitor's been dealing with his entire life. And this is where another one of those hidden background subtleties comes in that I want to talk about for just a moment. Voyager is Suitor's hell. I'll wait for you to finish laughing, because that probably sounds like a joke, but I really mean that sincerely. Suitor is someone who has spent his entire life struggling to control his violent impulses that just happen out of nowhere, struggling desperately to not cause this violence so that he could live, so that he could have his existence, so that he could coexist, at least to some extent, with society. It is no wonder that someone like him found the Maquis, probably leapt at the chance to join the Maquis, because it was an outlet, something he could do that would enable him to actually be a functional part of society, have a life. And then they end up in the Delta Quadrant. And then they end up on Voyager, on a Federation ship, with no outlet for his violence impulses whatsoever. Now, I know some of you out there are automatically saying, well, what about the holodeck? That's actually addressed in this episode. He himself says holographic violence just doesn't cut it. I want to talk about that in more detail later, but I just want to mention that now. That is actually addressed. So when I say Voyager is Suitor's hell, I kind of mean it literally. He is stuck on a small ship with no escape, with nowhere else to go, with no outlet whatsoever. And one of the lines in this episode I think really resonates with me is Tuvok commenting on how amazing it is that he maintained his control this long. This is mid-season 2 here. They've been here a year and a half. And he has managed to keep himself under control all this time. That is astonishing to me. That is incredible. But there's another layer of subtlety under this. How much Suitor wants to keep himself under control. All of this can be inferred from this simple scene right here, right at the beginning. From this one scene, from the performance of these two actors, we understand so much about this character. It fleshes him out wonderfully. This is someone who is diseased, broken inside, but doesn't want to be, but actively tries not to be, but understands just how horrible his life is. And we'll get more into that towards the end of this thing, because there's one final point about that. Let's move on. One other thing, again, Tim Russ does a great job in this episode too. I don't want to say I'm just praising Brad Dourif for his performance. Tim Russ portrays a wonderfully... I guess this is actually a good point to talk about it, okay? I recently did a video called Reading Too Much Into Stuff, right? And generally my point of that was, as long as you don't do it to too much of an extreme, I think that's overall a good thing. And I actually have a couple of examples of this across Star Trek, but this is the first one that's shown up, so this is the one I'm really going to talk about it in. Reading too much into things in a creative work, such as a television show, can lead to greater things, and this episode is an example of that. Because from all the interviews and all that, the original intent from the writing staff, from the people who wrote the episode, was the Meld screws up Tuvok because it was a Betazoid. That's it. That's all. Not because he was a psychotic, not because the violent impulses that Tuvok himself has, which is something we actually cover throughout the series, I might add. None of that. It's just the fact that he was a Betazoid. From that, both Brad Dourif, Tim Russ, the director, or all of the above, I don't actually know who, unfortunately, but I do know that the three of them collaborated and decided to go ahead and read too much into it. They read too much into it. They decided on their own initiative, whoever it was, I'm going to give credit to all three because I don't actually know who specifically was the impetus for this. They decided to read into their characters, read into the story, and pull more from it than was initially intended to be there, and the result was the performances we got. You see where I'm going with this? So Tim Russ portrays a Vulcan who sees this situation and is already mentally breaking as a result of it. Tim Russ is someone who is portraying a Vulcan whose mind has already basically skipped a beat and is now tripping as it's going around the wire, trying to figure out what's going on, because there was no motive. There was no motive. He gave me a funny look, is the best answer Suitor can give. Didn't like the way he looked at me, actually. I believe it was exactly how he phrased it. That's it. That's all. But Tuvok can't take that. And the reason they read into this was they were trying to figure out why Tuvok in his right mind would ever agree to this meld. Because that's a good question if you think about it. And if they hadn't added the subtlety of Tuvok's performance of a Vulcan whose mind is already breaking just because of acknowledgement of this situation, I feel like this episode would have been much weaker. Forgive me for segueing for just a second. But this is a topic I really wish had been covered more across Star Trek, because I believe this is one of only 2 times this is ever really discussed, really. The other is over on Deep Space Nine, very late in Deep Space Nine. I don't even remember the name of the episode. But it's the one where Ezri Dax, spoiler alert, is trying to pursue a serial killer who is, spoiler alert, I'll just wait a second just in case you really haven't seen this episode, turns out to be a Vulcan. And when asked what his reasoning was, it's one of those moments where you are told so little but you can extrapolate so much, because logic demanded it. I loved that point. I know a lot of Trekkers hate that scene and hate that episode, and I do apologize, but the reason I want to explain why I like it so much, because I feel that one of the things that should be explored a little bit more in Star Trek is the Vulcans encountering something that isn't, a mental influence. It's not some kind of energy being, or it's not some kind of poison or pheromone or alien influence or whatever. It's just they see something or hear something, interact with something, either over time or over a short period of time, whatever, it doesn't matter, that breaks their concept of logic. That their rigid way of adapting to and controlling themselves cannot handle whatever this is. In Tuvok's case, it was the idea that someone, and let's really extrapolate on this. It's not just that he murdered someone for no reason. He murdered someone basically knowing he would get caught on this small ship with no recourse, because, and blah 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 blah, all these reasons, and then he did it for no reason. That just breaks Tuvok's brain. And this is the same thing over here. We get the strong impression, they never actually say this outright because they don't have to. We get the strong impression that our Vulcan friend, the murderer, was so broken by the war that he couldn't take it, that it destroyed his ability to think about it. And so the only way that this could continue to function was if he got rid of the problem, which in his case was actually the thing that didn't fit those who were laughing. Because laughter doesn't fit in war, does it? I love this concept, and I really wish they explored it a little bit more, but I just wanted to comment on that because Tim Russ really throws himself into the idea of a Vulcan who is broken before the meld. And I also feel like pointing out Suter himself. Suter is the one who tries to talk Tuvok out of the meld. And if you watch the flow of the conversation, Suter is basically no, 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 until, and this is the other point I mentioned earlier, until Tuvok says that this might help you control your impulses. This might help you to take care of yourself and to, be more refined, to be able to have the mental discipline, blah, 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 blah. And that's what Suter wants. Many, many times in this episode, Suter demonstrates how much he wants to be rid of these violent impulses, how much he wants to not be like that anymore. I'm going to talk about something personal for just a moment. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I don't do anything. But I know people who do or have, and that's the important part. Any of you out there who know a recovering alcoholic, I'll use that because that's different. Alcoholism is not nearly as bad as most drug use, or cigarettes for that matter, and I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. I apologize. I don't like even talking about this because I know someone's just going to pick about my words and try to be inflammatory about it. Let's just talk about alcoholism because most people have encountered that, okay? That's a better reason. Any of you out there who know a recovering alcoholic know that this is, and I'll talk about this in basics too, the concept here is one drink is too many. For a normal person, having a glass of wine every now and again, or because of an event or whatever, is fine. But I know 3 recovering alcoholics actually, and props on them, good on them for having actually succeeded. I'm very proud of them. But one drink is too many, because even that one drink could trigger a relapse. You understand where I'm going with this? I don't want to talk too much about the real life subject there. That's way too inflammatory of a topic, and we're talking about Voyager here. But I make that comparison because that's exactly the situation Suter is and will be in. He doesn't want to kill. He needs to kill. And that's the difference. And he tries so hard not to. And when Tuvok tells him, this might give you the thing that has been denied you your whole life, all those treatments you've tried, all the medical sciences you've undergone, all the personal discipline you've tried to do, all that has failed. But if I give you this mind meld, you will probably learn some of my self-control and discipline, and that will help you to finally win. And you could see in his suitor's face and his motions, his expression, immediately done. All of his misgivings are gone. He gets up and says, "What do I have to do?" He is, and I mentioned that too because I think that line is significant. It's not just all right or I accept or whatever. He is willing to do whatever is necessary because of how much he wants this. I know I seem very sympathetic to Suitor, and I guarantee you a lot of that is because of Brad Dourif's performance. And I know that sounds weird, being sympathetic towards someone who is a killer. However, I would personally define Suitor as a killer, not a murderer. I'm not going to go into that topic. That's a whole other thing, and I don't want to get into it. But I think that is a crucial key difference. I have a great deal of sympathy for this character because I truly believe in my heart that he doesn't want to do these things and that he tries not to. And that is important to me. The fact that he tries not to, the fact that his intent is not to just go killing all willy-nilly, but his intent, his desire, is to just live his life, to be free of this sickness, this disease. I'm sorry for skipping ahead here, but there's a beautiful speech he gives towards Tuvok, right towards the end, which just emphasizes everything I'm telling you in a nutshell. How horrible it is living like this, how disgusting it is, how there is no turning back, how there is no way you'll ever be accepted again, how there is absolutely nothing that this can end. And then Tuvok tells him, "I seek no recovery, no return," or something like that. I don't want to come back from this. In other words, Tuvok is willing to die too. I'll talk about that more when we get to that point. But my point here is his return response to that. Suitor's response to that is, "Then we both die and the torment ends here." This disease of needing to kill in me and in you will end here, and it will be the better for it. And when he is being killed by the Meld, he smiles, because at least this will all be over. After the Meld, now that we've finally got to the actual Meld the episode's named for, that's another way you can kind of tell that a lot of this stuff was reading too much into it on the part of the actors and the directors and whatever. Because, again, the original writing of the episode was basically about two things: capital punishment and melding with non-humans. That really was the intent of the writers, those two interests. All this rest of the stuff was extrapolated by the people working on it. And me, of course, because that's what I do. But I know I've already talked about Tim Russ's wonderful performance, but even after the Meld, he does wonderful little things to show just how much it's affected him. I'm talking about before he goes psychotic. It's only like 3 scenes, but in all 3 of those scenes, his neck, I don't know if you can even see, I'm doing it right now, his neck will twitch. Just not even as often as I'm doing it, every now and again. He blinks more often than usual. He'll do things with his hands, and he looks like he's just holding his hands like this, but if you pay attention, what Russ is actually doing is he's gripping it so hard. Now I'm shaking because I shake when my muscles strain. It's a thing, but you probably can't even tell, especially because the lighting here is not exactly professional. But my hands are more white because I'm gripping myself so hard. You know, all these little details Russ was throwing in to show how much the Meld has affected him. Not just because it wasn't a human, which was again the main point, but because of everything that's been breaking him up to and including this point. You follow? And shoulder movements. I actually made a note of that. He does these little things with his shoulders where he's like, just, and it's wonderful because the head and shoulders shot is pretty much standard for Star Trek, for television in general, actually. And so you kind of only have so much to work with, but he still decided to use his shoulders to get across this point. Wonderful shot. Let's talk about holographic violence. I'm finally to that point. So I mentioned earlier, Neelix had to be annoying because of this scene. Why? Well, let's think about this logically. Tuvok is trying to test his self-control. So he goes onto the holodeck and he thinks, okay, I need something that's going to throw me into a violent rage, something that is going to cause me to attempt to kill someone. How do I do this? Well, okay, could I think of maybe my homeworld being destroyed by a Romulan displaced from time? No, that would never work. Nobody would ever go for that. Maybe we should go with something like my mother falling to death right in front of me. No, that wouldn't work either. I'm sorry. The point I'm trying to get across here is, what does he go for? Neelix. The thing that provokes Tuvok, that he intentionally goes on in character to provoke an emotional response to, with intent to kill, is Neelix. And the problem is that when they did that scene, Ethan Phillips, I should say, was told, basically, dial it up to 11. Play yourself as annoying as you've ever been. Just be the most aggravatingly irritating character you can be. Because that was the point. Because he was a holographic Neelix, and this is important, who was intended to be more annoying than the real one. Now, actually, as weird as this sounds, I'm actually kind of okay with that. I know. I've bragged a lot about their treatment of Neelix throughout the series, but if they had chopped out the earlier scene and this was it, that would actually kind of make sense. Something that irritates Tuvok on a regular basis, but ramped up to an extreme. The catch is the creators of the show felt that wouldn't fit if they didn't establish that Neelix is annoying to Tuvok in this episode. So they pretty much immediately after filming this scene with the same set and everything threw in a bunch of extras and then said, okay, now be that same incredibly annoying character, and then we'll shove this towards the beginning of the episode. And that doesn't work nearly as well for me, because all of a sudden Neelix goes from being, a slight exaggeration, a holographic representation of what Tuvok finds irritating about other races, and I could do all sorts of reading into this, I really could, to Neelix is a dick. The end. It just saps so much of the dramatic potential of that, and it just kind of makes it stupid, and it's really a disservice to both characters in my opinion. But holographic violence, right? This is interesting. I actually didn't even realize this when I was rewatching this episode, because Suter actually doesn't mention the holographic problem until after this. But I think it's interesting because of the way this is presented. Tuvok goes to the holodeck to test his self-control, and then he tries, he kills Neelix. However, immediately afterwards, he determines that that didn't solve the problem. That didn't solve the need to kill, didn't satisfy it, or whatever. Shortly thereafter, he talks with Suter. And one of the things he asks him is, why not use holograms? I find that interesting in its own right, because I believe that was done on purpose. I believe, this may be more reading into it, but I think what actually happened there was Tuvok was basically saying, the holographic thing didn't do anything for me. Does it work for you? And Suter gives the expected answer. No. Now I wanted to talk about this a bit because I've always felt like the holodeck is more of a mental thing than a physical thing. Now let me explain that a little bit. So much of the interactions on the holodeck, with the characters on the holodeck, with the programs on the holodeck, can be explained by the fact that the people, the fiction... Okay, we're dealing with two layers of fiction here. So for the moment, we're going to refer to the actual Star Trek fiction as real and the holographic fiction as fiction. Okay, just to simplify this. Okay, we're moving a step in the Inception circle. All right. The real people going on to that know that the fake people are fake. They know that. And that is an important difference. If you played any video game which involves killing people, does that bother you? I'm talking about normal violence, and I know that sounds weird, but just bear with me. If you go into Fallout and you have to shoot a bandit, does that bother you? No, of course it doesn't. If you go into Dragon Age and have to kill, some guy because he's a jerk, he's trying to rob you in your group, does that bother you? If you're playing a war game and you have to shoot enemy combatants, that doesn't even faze you, because mentally you know it's fake. And I am sorry, however much bluster and just big man talk or woman talk I have heard, I guarantee you it is different in real life. Real violence is an ugly thing. We don't like real violence as a people. Not really. We like romanticized violence. We like filtered violence. I like filtered violence. I praise Assassin's Creed, a series about killing people because of how romanticized it is. I can still enjoy that. Mass Effect. There are scenes where you shoot someone in the head. Do you know what that would do in real life? But in there, it just involves a spray of blood. And I like that. I don't want the realism. So when you go on the holodeck, you know you're in a video game. And so I ask you, to use the parallel here, if you genuinely had a problem in real life, we're moving back out of the Inception here, in real life, in your brain, where you needed to kill, do you think that would be satisfied by a video game? It doesn't matter how realistic that video game is. I'm sorry, I've said this before and I'll say this again. The holodeck is basically the furthest extent of video game technology. That's the end game basically of video games. Whatever's after that is not going to be video games anymore. It's going to be something else. You know? And so it's no surprise to me that they did this, and I think it's a good thing that they did because it makes perfect sense. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I apologize for getting serious there for a moment. Afterwards, we have a scene I was just talking about, with the last scene for a while between Tuvok and Suter, as the two of them are just talking about it. And Tuvok is literally breaking down by the moment. I want to give more props to the actors. I know I've given a lot already, but bear with me, because what actually happened was Brad Dourif and Tim Russ, when they were practicing this scene, switched places. And Brad Dourif played the barely controlled psychopath who was doing the thing, and Tim Russ played the completely composed and calm Vulcan. And what they were doing was they were watching each other, so that when they actually did the scene, their roles were actually reversed. So Brad Dourif plays the completely controlled, calmed Vulcan. And if you notice, every single one of his moves, it's very Tuvok-like. It's very precise. Everything he does is very carefully calculated, kind of what I do, actually, in real life. You know, or actually, I'm sorry, what I used to do back when I hadn't learned how to be as smooth as I am, when it was all just robot movements and, you know, everything was just carefully, you know, that kind of thing. It's very much like that. Whereas Tuvok, on the other hand, is just completely losing it over there, and he's shaking, and he's sweating, and his neck's twitching, and he's blinking all over the place, you know, all that fun stuff. It really adds to the flavor of the scene, and I give credit to them for going that extra mile. Whoever has idea what that was a great idea. And on top of that, I want to mention once again, this is an excellent development of Suter as a character. Everything I mentioned before that I extrapolated on is laid out bare here. Suter has hated living like this. Suter wants to get better. Suter actively wants to continue with this. In fact, one of the things he asks is, can we meld again? Because of how much he wants to maintain this level of self-control. And he is willing to do all the mental discipline, all the meditation, and all that necessary in order to maintain this self-control. And when Tuvok says it would not be wise to meld again, Suter says, you're right, it wouldn't. I understand. And then Suter starts talking about how melds are, in their own way, a violence. It's wonderfully horrible because Suter is just right there in Tuvok's brain, but he's not deliberately messing with him. He is doing what a Vulcan would do. Detached observation and analysis. Talking about how violence is a horrible, disgusting, ugly thing, and yet has its own appeal to it, in his words, because of the way he thinks, because of what he's been through, because of all the horrible things that he's been through, and he knows Tuvok's been through. We know Tuvok has some pretty horrible violence issues. Again, this will be covered later. So I think it's an interesting and wonderful trick that these two... And I'm sorry, Suter has a line I actually wrote down. I'm just going to say that because this really summarizes it beautifully. Ironic that I can share with you, of all people, what I have hidden from everyone my entire life. I love that. Now, we've only got a few more notes, I swear, and then we'll finish this up. First of all, Janeway's an idiot! Seriously, that's actually my note right here. Janeway is an idiot. I'm not actually kidding. Let's say you're walking in, you've come with a security guard, and you know that Tuvok just melded with a psychopath. Well, he's not actually a psychopath, but you know he's melded with someone who's deranged, and he's informed you that he's no longer fit for duty. And so you go into his room, which is destroyed. He has just mashed the hell out of it, and he says, "Do not enter." What do? You enter without the security guard because you're an idiot. And then he says, "Please don't come any closer." Well, of course, the first thing you do is come closer. No, I'm sorry. I don't want to bring real life too much into this again. But if you've ever dealt with someone who has actual mental instability issues, and if they are telling you, don't do this, don't come closer, don't provoke them. That is one of the most dangerous and stupid things you can do because I know this is hard to understand, but because of that whole mental instability thing, whatever way it manifests, they can't control themselves. You moron! God, I wanted to smack her. I would have been so satisfied if he just lunged at her and not kill her, of course. That'd be terrible. But just to give her a nice bruise across the jaw for her stupidity. Ugh. And then, of course, the security guard shoots Tuvok, and then they cut to the get to the medical room as they're trying to fix him. In fact, I think that would have been a better scene, to be a little bit blunt with you. But let's move on. And then I finally get to the point. This is actually finally when we get to the actual point that the writers had originally. There's a few lines that the Doctor has on it, but really what it boils down to is the writers felt that all the mind melds, with very few exceptions, had basically been done with humans or other Vulcans up until this point in the show. And that's basically true. There are a couple of exceptions, but let's not go into that. The bottom line is, it had always been with humans, and Vulcans melding with humans has basically never really been an issue. The writer, in this case, wanted to examine what would happen if a Vulcan melded with another race, and he felt that betazoids were a good choice. That's why Suitor was a betazoid. In fact, the Doctor comments on how this goes wrong more often than not, implying that every other time when we haven't seen a meld, it's been with another race and it's gone poorly. And in fact, the Doctor has a specific line about how a Vulcan mind and a Betazoid mind just aren't compatible. You get where I'm going with this. All of that was basically just to explore that little point. It's an interesting little point, and that's all I'm going to say about it, because really I have nothing else to say about it. Now, originally, this is fascinating, because originally I started writing. Okay, there's a big scene where Tuvok is edited. His brain is edited, his telepathic abilities are shut off, and his mental control is shut off. I'd just like to pause for a moment and say how terrifying it is that with a few computer presses and some neck thingies, forehead thingies, you can actually turn off portions of someone's brain. But let's not even touch that. This is Star Trek. We can do all sorts of medicalese stuff. What I find interesting about this is I was originally writing down a completely other point, but as I watched the scene, I actually rewound it and watched it from a different perspective, and I think I was all wrong about this. The original point I was going to make was how much of that personality variance was because of what given source, because from what we know, there's several things that could have altered Tuvok's personality at this point. Literally altered it, altered his brain. Number one, the meld. I mean, duh, right? Meld with a Betazoid and meld with Suitor specifically. Both of those are relevant points. Number two, the fact that his brain is being edited by a damn computer. Now, I know that sounds weird, but it is relevant. And then the point that we are meant to believe, the obvious point, which I do believe is a screen for what's actually going on here, the fact that his self-control is off. It's actually interesting. This may be me reading too much into it, but given what we've already seen in the episode, I actually don't think it is. We are led to believe that what is happening is this is Tuvok without his self-control, and that's why he's acting in such a horrible fashion. And as weird as this sounds, while I think that is true, but I think that is a smokescreen for what's really going on here. If you pay attention to everything Tuvok says, everything he gets across, everything he tells them about, with the exception of his first few moments of "this feels different," so, excluding that, everything he says, all the horrible things he says to the Doctor, to Kes, and to Janeway, every single one of them makes sense if you view them with a simple perspective. That Tuvok needs to kill. You see where I'm going with this? I'm sorry, I'm smiling because it's so wonderfully constructed. It's like... It's one of those things like Grand Theft Auto 4. I've talked about this in brief before. I keep meaning to actually do a video about that game. It's blatantly in your face, and yet it's so blatantly in your face that you actually miss the subtleties of what's going on. It's not lying to you. This is what's happening, but this is also what's happening. You see where I'm going with this? And so what we see here is Tuvok, everything he says is specifically and calculatedly designed. It's very Tuvok because he is specifically targeting Janeway with his words and his tone, and specifically targeting the Doctor and specifically targeting Kes, specifically for only one purpose: to get him out of this cell, to get her sufficiently riled up to agree to his plan so he can kill Suitor. But killing Suitor isn't the point. Suitor himself calls him out on that later on. Killing Suitor isn't the point. This isn't about justice. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about anything. It's about the fact that Tuvok currently has the same problems Suitor does. For whatever reason, it doesn't actually matter why he has this. What matters is Tuvok now has the same need to kill Suitor did. And Suitor is a convenient target for that. And I think it adds wonderful layers to his performance and to that scene. It's a scene I didn't actually like on my very first viewing, Once Upon a Time. And on subsequent viewings, I always just kind of go, that scene. But when I really looked at that scene, and indeed rewatched it this time around, like I said, I rewound and watched the scene again. That's powerful stuff. So, props, Now, we only have a couple more points here. I already mentioned this in brief. I really already talked about this, but I was supposed to talk here about Suitor's speech at the end, about how miserable about he is, about how one kill is too many, how you can never go back. He has a whole speech, and he is right in Tuvok's face with it. You can see the blatant, naked honesty in his speech as he's telling Tuvok, you will never be able to come back from this. This is a point of no return, and there is nothing that can ever save you or your life or your place in society after this point. And you could practically see him begging Tuvok not to kill him, even though, by the same token, he never actually begs Tuvok not to kill him. He never actually tells him not to do it, and for two reasons. One, he understands, and two, and I mentioned I'd talk about this later, he wants to die. Voyager is Suitor's hell. And he has come to the logical conclusion, thanks to the self-control and his own experiences that he has gained from previous and including this episode, that Tuvok will not be allowed to meld with him again. And as a result of that, he will not be able to control himself anymore. And he will be destroyed from the inside out, or forced to kill someone again, and neither of those are things he wants, and he just wants it to be over. I have no doubt that Suitor was at least partially suicidal prior to this episode. But given the events of the episode, and given where he is, the hell he is trapped in, I have absolutely no doubt that he is suicidal now. And he gets that across fully in his performance. Then we will die together, and the torment will end here, because he doesn't wish Tuvok to live with that either. And like I said, he is smiling when Tuvok is trying to kill him with the meld. And he almost looks disappointed for a moment when he doesn't. A couple final notes. First and foremost, what I would change about this episode is minute. Literally, I would only change two things. Actually, I'd really only change one, but I'll talk about that in a moment. I already mentioned what I would do with the Neelix scene. In fact, I think one of the things I would do, if you want the early Neelix scene, show it in contrast, not in reformation. Rather than have him be incredibly annoying in the first scene and incredibly annoying in the second scene, have him be completely normal in the first scene. And I don't mean normal Neelix. I mean have him be my Neelix, the Neelix who has a frickin' brain and wasn't an irritant, stupid, I'm stupid because it's funny Neelix. Have him be a character again. Have him be someone who's concerned about Tuvok. Have him someone who's trying to get his respect, who's talking about him about this or that, and just, discussing old Vulcan traditions with him and why the Vulcans gave up about it. Showing an interest in him, that kind of a thing, right? Now, yeah, Tuvok would find that irritating, but Neelix isn't actually being irritating and doing that. You see the difference here? Then have the contrast. In the second scene where Neelix is just right up in his face and dialing it up to 11, I would actually leave that as is, because with the contrast, I feel it works great. Second thing I would change, like I said, this is kind of a weird thing. I would have the treatment on Tuvok not actually work. Now, this is one of those things that would only work if it were to change the next several episodes and possibly the rest of the series. And what I mean by that is I could see several possibilities here. Just two I'm going to toss at you. Number one, why not have this treatment work partially? Why not have it work, slowly, over time. The doctor, I know, I thought about this as the moment the doctor said, right thing, we don't know how long the treatment plan may take. It could be days, it could be months, it could be never. That line seems like such a throwaway, because it's Star Trek. He's going to be fixed at the end of the episode, right? Why not have him not be fixed? Why not have him be partially fixed, or barely fixed? Why not show Tuvok as a slightly different character, someone who is struggling with his self-control, someone who is not the same Tuvok he was at the beginning of the episode, someone who is still in some ways broken. And as he slowly copes and adapts with this, and this is possibility 2, because see, possibility 1 is he just slowly copes and then, it finally works, and have it be a big deal in the episode where it finally works. But I actually like that idea a lot less than idea 2 here, which is have him slowly cope and adapt and never actually get better. You see where I'm going with this? Have Tuvok have a fundamental, permanent character change. Consequences matter, That's what continuity is really about. Have this be the beginning of his character arc changing, and having him become the new Tuvok. And you could do so much more with that. I couldn't even begin to list all the things you could do with a new Tuvok. A Vulcan who has been broken, but managed to survive it. Think about what you could do with that. I'm just going to name one example right off the top of my head. Think about how different the episode Flashback would be if we had changed Tuvok, emotional Tuvok, or different Tuvok, whatever it is you ended up deciding on, as opposed to logical Tuvok. Imagine the difference in that. And the best part is, in Flashback, you could actually show the difference. You could actually show how far he's changed, how far he's come, because you could actually then you could do splice shots so that the old Tuvok was old Tuvok, Vulcan, logical, blah, 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 and new Tuvok be the one that has grown from that. Tell me that wouldn't have added to that episode. But I digress. I promised this at the end here, and I'm going to say it here. I have only touched on this like twice, this whole video. What I mentioned, there were 2 things the writers wanted to do with this episode when they first sat down to pen it. One was, the non-human Meld, and the other is capital punishment. Now, right off the bat, I want to give the writers a great deal of credit for doing something Star Trek almost never does. They don't resolve the issue. They deliberately paint the issue, show some of the pros, show some of the cons, and then leave it unresolved. So often Star Trek gets, forgive me, preachy. And a lot of times Star Trek writers will get up on soapboxes. Now, we've all done this. All of us who are writers have done this. We've all said, this is my agenda and I want to push it. Sometimes we do it subconsciously. I've done it too. I try really hard not to do it these days, but I have done it too. In fact, there are a few things that I actually deliberately do that about nowadays, and I admit that. But I like it when they actually paint an issue and then say nothing, They let the viewer decide. They leave the issue dangling for you to figure out what you want. They actually do. The Voyager actually does this more than once, believe it or not, which is really surprising to me. I actually can't remember the name of the episodes, but there's the fighting episode, which was the crossover with the World Wrestling Federation or whatever. Sunkatsuki or something like that. I can't remember the name of it. And there's another one with regards to the Cardassian assistant that the Doctor has show up for that in order to assist in getting the parasite off of Taurus. Forgive me for not remembering the name of these episodes, but for those of you who've seen the series, you know what I'm talking about. Both of these episodes do the same thing. They raise an issue, but they don't, and they show both sides clearly, but they don't actually show one side as correct. They don't actually say this is the right answer and resolve it because this is the right answer. Instead, they let you think about it, you decide about it, and I like that. I like the way they do that. And this episode is no exception. Capital punishment is the issue brought up by this episode. And like I said right at the beginning, what do we do about violence? Because violence does happen. It happens for so many reasons that listing them all would take years, if not more, because more reasons would crop up in those years, Violence has been happening for all of human history that we are aware of. But what do you do about it? I happen to live in the United States. Spoiler alert. Here in the United States, in several states, capital punishment is legal. It's something that is allowed. And yet, despite that fact, it is almost never employed. I don't want to talk about this at length. I really don't. And the simple reason why is that this is one of those charged topics. I've mentioned this many times. A heavily emotional topic that most people can't discuss. They can only argue. People tend to get pretty worked up about this topic, especially around here. But I think the really important question that is brought up by this is, do you think that an individual, in an absolute sense, does deserve some capacity of rehabilitation if they have committed such a heinous crime? Now, I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong any more than the episode does, but I will point out some of the arguments the episode itself brings up. One is the concept of justice and vengeance. Let's make sure we keep those separate and clear. Justice, at its basic form, is about balancing the scales, equaling out to 0. You have killed someone, -1. Therefore, we need to balance it back up to 0 somehow. Or in this case, it would actually be more like this. But you get where I'm going with this, right? You have stolen. You've done this, and therefore we will do this to you to balance the scales, right? The catch with that idea is that, in general, justice does not involve rehabilitation. Justice does not encourage rehabilitation. Justice is balancing the scales. That's all it is. It is a neutral thing. At least it should be. You get where I'm going. The concept of justice is a neutral thing. So, what about vengeance then? Well, vengeance is more emotional. Vengeance actually is not as distinct from justice as most people tend to think, because the only difference with vengeance is your personal stake in the matter. Justice, let's say we have a society right now where if you commit murder, you are killed. Cut and dry, right? I know, just bear with me on this, because the point I'm trying to make here is, let's assume that's what happens. And that is, let's be honest with ourselves, in many ways, justice. Because all it does is it balances the scales out. It doesn't do anything else. No other considerations whatsoever, okay? We want to make this as simple as possible. Bam, okay? Vengeance is when you, who is a victim of that person, or as one of the victim's family members, or someone who has been personally wounded by the crimes they've committed, you go out to commit that justice upon them. But not because you care about justice, and this is the other distinction. Justice is not what you're interested in. You are interested in hurting them because they hurt you. And that is why it is vengeance, aka revenge. Because that's the difference between vengeance and justice. And we see both the sides of justice and vengeance in this episode. Justice is the idea that this man killed someone, and something needs to happen as a result of that. Several ideas are bandied about. Vengeance is brought up by Tuvok himself. What would his sisters think? What would his family think? He needs to die for what he's done. Blah, 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 blah. He brings that up more than a few times. Suter himself calls him out on it, actually. But then let's look at the other side. Rehabilitation. Now, I'm going to be totally blunt here, and I'm actually going to be honest about one thing about my views. I normally don't do that when it comes to charged issues, because I don't want to get into it. But I think, please pay attention to my words, in my opinion, in an idealized, optimized situation and society, rehabilitation should always be the choice. Please pay attention to the way I said that, okay? If you have the capacity to rehabilitate someone, to fix someone, and I'm just going to say it like that, if you have the ability to fix someone, then I think that should be the preferable choice. And we do see the benefits of that in part in this episode. Unfortunately, that side isn't given quite as much of a focus because that's not the focus of the episode. The focus is more on the character piece, which is all on the justice and vengeance side of Tuvok and Suter over here. But Janeway is clearly on that side. And she does stand firm in her beliefs in that. She believes that before she even considers the idea that Suter needs to go away or be incarcerated or justiced or vengeanced, we need to try fixing him first. Now that may be seen as idealistic and optimistic, and that's because it is. Whether or not that's foolish or not, that depends on the circumstances. Now in these specific circumstances, I believe that's not foolish. Because as I've said many times, and as we've seen in the episode and in the next two episodes he shows up in, Suter wants to get better. Suitor has an active interest and desire, and, again, as we see in the future, has been willing to put the time, effort, and work, the hard work, into getting better. So I think in this case, rehabilitation would be the correct choice. But, and this is the horrible thing, we cannot exclude the emotional factor from this, because we're not Vulcans. We're people. As much as I agree with that concept, forgiveness and love and caring and all that fun stuff that I truly believe in down to my core, I also believe that we are emotional creatures. I also understand what it's like to have someone I care about hurt. You know? And I understand that if you took that person who hurt that person, I'm not going to say names or genders or anything, but I'm thinking of someone specific. If you took that person and genuinely, successfully rehabilitated them, would I stop loathing them? Would I stop deriding them? Would I ever be able to forgive and forget? To be completely blunt with you, probably not. And that's the messy problem here. I feel like even though that probably shouldn't be a part of the impartial system, it still needs to be acknowledged because we aren't robots. We're people. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed. I'll be talking about this topic a lot more when we come to Babylon 5. Ironically, also the episode involving Brad Dourif. You know the one I'm talking about if you know the show. And it's a great episode, I'd just like to say on the side. But I'm going to end this on the basic point here that I still don't actually know, which if you actually put a gun to my head and said pick, I'm not sure which I would. It's a messy topic. It's a messy issue. The best I could say is that I think it depends on the individual circumstances. That each thing needs to be seen as a case-by-case basis. And the problem with that, because nothing in life is ever easy, is that it's costly in terms of time, money, and effort. And that's how I'm going to end this episode, I think. I hope you've enjoyed my return to Voyager. I actually have. It's been a great episode to talk about. And I hope to see you later.